Good morning, everybody. It's Steve Brown from Mirae Asset Securities, Mirae Asset Live, with Tim Kramer, Associate Director of KPMG and Head of Special Situations Group for Vietnam and Cambodia. Tim, good morning.
Good morning, Stephen. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Now, Tim, you've been leading this division for over 2 years in Vietnam and Cambodia. You've also been about 8 years experience in the sector of interest special situations. Through the course of the conversation, we'll have a chat to you about how you've seen the changing landscape in Vietnam in special situations service provision for KPMG, and how you think the transition for the whole accountancy space in Vietnam is proactively benefiting both the FDI investors, the FII investors, and also the local corporates, listed, unlisted, getting to a global standard, so their companies are becoming more investable in the eyes of foreign investors, more attractive for local M&A activity as well, with the transparency and clarity of the reporting going on in Vietnam. So, firstly though, you're Dutch. What made you decide to come to Vietnam?
It's an interesting question. So I'm Dutch, like you said. My partner is Peruvian. So when we both lived and worked in the UK, in London for 6 years, this meant we were both living and working abroad, but we were always really curious and keen to see a completely different market, a completely different culture and a different business environment as well. And when we traveled to Vietnam, actually in 2018, that's when our eyes were really open to Vietnam. We were really amazed by the culture, the people, and also all the business that you visibly see going on around Ho Chi Minh City. So from that moment on, we always kept our eyes on Vietnam. My partner moved first with her employer around early 2020. And when it became clear that KPMG Vietnam was looking to establish a special situations group in line with the team and the methodology that we were using in my team in the UK, I decided to move as well and moved later in 2020.
Now, so London to Vietnam and Cambodia is a huge transition. So any expectations, or were you briefed by Warwick Klein, the chairman and CEO of the region? I would assume it's been a bit of not only a culture shock, probably a business and normal client interface change. Just give us a little bit of enlightenment there.
It's true. It's a completely different market, a completely different country. But I have to say that the differences are much more subtle than I expected. I expected to move to the other side of the world and feel like you're on the other side of the world. But I remember moving to the Ho Chi Minh City office, sitting there the first day and thinking, did I just move to Ho Chi Minh City or did I just move to KPMG Manchester? It felt so familiar.
Okay.
And I think a big reason for that actually is the welcoming nature and the openness of the Vietnamese people. I think even though over the past 2 years I've been able to learn so much about the Vietnamese culture and how rich the culture is, I've also learned to appreciate how open and welcoming people are over here. And even though when I moved to Ho Chi Minh City, I didn't speak any Vietnamese, I essentially knew nobody in the city, I felt included and able to integrate from day one.
Mm-hmm. And expanding on that, KPMG's operations in Vietnam, highly regarded executive chair and CEO in Warwick Klein. His team that you've joined, about 1,800 staff nationwide, plus Phnom Penh in Cambodia. I think you were mentioning 5 offices now as well regionally. So just explain the footprint and client type.
Fantastic. We've been in the markets from around 1994. That's when KPMG Vietnam and Cambodia were established. At the moment, like you correctly say, we have about 1,800 people across Vietnam and Cambodia spread over 5 offices. That includes 2 of our Ho Chi Minh City offices, 1 office in Hanoi, an office in Da Nang, a really interesting growth region in the center of Vietnam, and an office in Cambodia in Phnom Penh. And across these offices, we run a full suite of professional services that includes audit, it includes consulting services, and it includes a full spectrum of deals, tax, and legal services as well.
Okay. And Special Situations Group now, what does it do in Vietnam? Who do you do it for in Vietnam? And who do you do it for who would like to come to Vietnam?
Really good question. And actually, almost all of my client conversations and client meetings start with exactly the question that you just answered. It's definitely a new term in the market. So a lot of our meetings start with what exactly is the Special Situations Group? And effectively what we do is we focus on delivering financial improvements to companies in Vietnam, to investors looking to invest in Vietnam across a range of situations these clients may be in. So that may mean that one day we're working for a young and growing company which now needs to shift its focus to, say, profitability and cash. We were recently at the e-commerce seminar, right, where we heard that even the e-commerce industry, which has really focused on growth and user acquisition in the past few years, now also needs to focus on profitability and cash management. The other day we may be working with a really mature business, which is highly profitable, potentially the leader in their industry, but still underperforming on key financial metrics against sector peers. Other times we may be working with clients where cash preservation and financial performance improvement is more imminently required, maybe a turnaround type of situation. Or we may be working with businesses that are going through a deal, looking to pose a value creation story to investors post-deal, as well as with investors looking to buy into Vietnamese companies in order to see what kind of value creation opportunities they may be able to realize post-deal.
Okay. And the team at the moment, with the financial improvement that you can bring to the companies, can you expand on some deal examples that you've done? Companies wanting to come in an FDI sense, and then if you can, in an FII example as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We work across both of these spectrums. So we support a lot of foreign investors, whether that be private equity funds, strategic buyers, sovereign wealth funds, through either foreign direct investment or foreign indirect investment in order to buy into Vietnamese companies. We often work together with our financial due diligence teams under an approach we call one due diligence, which means that we offer financial due diligence services, commercial due diligence services, legal due diligence services, tax due diligence services, as well a value creation opportunity assessment in order to paint a rich picture of how these businesses work, what the potential opportunities and risks are, and some post-deal recommendations to these investors. So in the most recent years, we've done a lot of work in the food and beverage industry. We've done a lot of work in the consumer products industry, manufacturing, right across the spectrum. We've supported a lot of FDI and FII in the most recent years since we started the Special Situations Group.
So do you see country differences, variations in service provision with Cambodia and Vietnam, or are they quite comparative?
They're relatively comparative. I would say the stock market in Cambodia is younger than the stock market in Vietnam in general. But across KPMG, Vietnam and Cambodia, we work as one team. We work on the same deals. And to be honest, the approach is similar. When it comes to differences in approach, it is more related normally to the investor's country. So certain countries may have a preference for visiting the companies that they're looking to buy in person, meeting management, going through the site visits. Other countries may be more comfortable with doing a remote acquisition, and doing remote interviews with management, etc.
Okay.
And we tailor our approach to those preferences.
Yep. And how do you see both countries' economic development progressing in the next few years? The GDP growth story for Vietnam's been on a tear for several years. GDP per capita over 3,700 USD equivalent or thereabouts now. And do you expect to see the stock market advancement in Cambodia? You noticed it was quite nascent, not too many listed securities there at the minute. The team for Special Situations Group, what's your outlook on both markets?
I think Vietnam and Cambodia remain some of the most promising and high-performing growth markets in the world. But there are currently challenges ahead, and we do see special situations even in these growth markets. Like last week, we had our KPMG Next seminar, which is an annual seminar when we bring together sector leaders for a specific industry. This year, we brought together sector leaders across the manufacturing and distribution industries in order to talk about current challenges and opportunities in those sectors. And what we discussed there was that even though we still see strong growth over the next years for both markets, rising inflation, as well as falling consumer demand in some of our key export markets are already starting to have a negative economic impact on Vietnam and Cambodia as well. And we see that in the order books of manufacturers at the moment. Of course, this may have a spillover effect as well into some adjacent industries such as logistics, maybe through reduced international trade volumes. It can impact luxury goods disproportionately as consumers may shift their focus to household necessities. So it may have an impact across the economy. So there's definitely strong growth, but challenges in the market as well. And we know that the real estate sector is facing its own challenges at the moment through restrictions on lending, bond issuance, etc., which may leave developers, contractors, and investors in financially difficult situations at times.
Okay. And so that was a bit of a challenge. The biggest opportunities for businesses based in Vietnam, with the post-pandemic reopening being a success, to what extent do you see the successful areas, and where do you think the Special Situations Group will be most focused on?
Well, the good news is that inflation seems more under control in our domestic markets than in our export markets at the moment. So domestic demand is still on the rise. So companies that are focused on domestic consumers within Vietnam are seeing an uplift. Similarly, tourism is definitely rebounding. With the easing of most travel restrictions, tourists are coming back into the city, back into the countries, which means that hospitality is seeing a resurgence. Of course, though, coming back from a prolonged period of virtually no activity, so it may take time to recover. Another opportunity that we definitely have in these markets is infrastructure. Right? A lot of investment has gone into infrastructure around some of the major cities, but say in Vietnam, around the Mekong Delta, around the center of Vietnam, there's still a lot of opportunity for growth and improvement.
Now, if we look at the opportunities that can flow from accounting advances in Vietnam, IFRS, the Ministry of Finance approved on the 16th of March 2020 phase 1 implementation for that. And so from this year, 2022 through to 2025, they're working on the phase 1 implementation of that. The State Bank of Vietnam, though, is looking after the banking reporting and also the consumer finance sectors. But aside from that, it's now quite full steam ahead, isn't it, for Vietnam to advance toward the international IFRS standards. So I'm sure a lot of your FDI plus FII client base that's looking at investing in either listed securities, getting strategic stakes in companies here, or becoming a major FDI investor here would appreciate the global standard of IFRS. Have you you are one of the companies that's very heavily involved with educating and supporting both listed corporates and also the members of the VCCI in this area. What's your take on the adoption of that timeline? You think by 2025 it's all looking quite good?
It's difficult to comment on the timeline of the adoption, but what I will say is that across the investor community and in Vietnam, it's seen as an extremely positive move in order to promote international comparability and interpretation of financial statements. And we do, since 2021 now, have a dedicated IFRS adoption practice within KPMG, Vietnam and Cambodia. And I promise you they're extremely busy at the moment. So we are seeing activity in this area, both to transition the reporting itself, as well as to help with implementation of the systems that support this type of reporting.
Yes, what's come? I've been here since 2013, and prior to KPMG having Special Situations Group, we'd often have, like your peers as well, we'd often have clients looking at FDI opportunities that would say to us, can we receive this client's audited FS? And back then, it was quite a rare event that they actually even had an audited FS. You know, they were mostly on audited books because they were unlisted. They didn't need to, even though they're many times successful SMEs, successful family businesses, entrepreneurs, but they hadn't applied that process of reporting. You know, so now I think the Vietnamese business community is very much on the front foot, and they're very aware that getting up to the global standard will increase the FDI interest, and also, you know, in the secondary market space, a lot of more investability will come into the listed equity space when people can see the pathway to IFRS coming up. The other things, can you share some experiences on the entrepreneurs that you've come across in Vietnam? Because we were both at the e-commerce conference for Vietnam recently, and that space is booming in Vietnam, isn't it? The fintech space and everything else. And what's your take on Vietnam's position in ASEAN in this sector?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of entrepreneurial activity in Vietnam. It's really exciting to see that even if you go away for a 2-week holiday or so, you'll come back and you'll see so many new businesses, new brands emerged in such a short time period. I think Vietnam is absolutely a leading growth market in this area. There's a lot of Vietnamese businesses that are now being pushed to the forefront in Vietnam, but also in the region, which is amazing to see. And at KPMG, we really value that entrepreneurial activity, because we do acknowledge that the entrepreneurs and the startups today are going to be industry leaders tomorrow or in the future. So we do tend to stay really close to these businesses and coach and nurture them as they progress, whether that's through special situations, say performance optimization solutions, such as helping them to control their cost base, improve cash and working capital procedures, or whether it's through audit or consulting or legal advice.
And do you engage with the co-work share hubs as well, that are kind of a go-to office location for a lot of startup entrepreneurs? Because there are many successful WeWork kind of comparative businesses here. The Sentry's one, that's a very successful one in Ho Chi Minh City. And there are many others as well, where the young up-and-coming entrepreneurial fintech, e-commerce type of business startups, they can, in an inexpensive way, get a premium office location in District 1 or District 2 of Ho Chi Minh City, and be able to engage with the business community. Do you, at KPMG, do you engage with the operators of those practices as well as a strategy, or are you mainly focused on the clients of those, or are you doing both?
Potentially not as a strategy, but we do engage heavily with the business community. We support businesses across sectors in Vietnam, and we're proud to see business growth across sectors within Vietnam and Cambodia. The co-working space area is really interesting. I have friends, families, professional connections who work from these co-working spaces, who definitely tell me that, you know, there's such a big benefit from being surrounded by kind of like-minded entrepreneurs who are trying to achieve the same with a different business and learning from each other's ideas. I think it's a relatively crowded space at the moment, the industry. So there's a lot of co-working spaces popping up around the city. And I do think that that space is becoming more competitive as well. But it's really exciting to see. And to be honest, even in KPMG, you know, we significantly promote agile ways of working, meaning that, yes, we have our offices here in Ho Chi Minh City, around the rest of the country, and most of the week we will be there or at clients. But every now and then we also encourage our staff to either, you know, work from home or work from another place that's more convenient if they have to travel to a client meeting, etc. As long as they protect their confidential information and get the work done, we're a big supporter of agile ways of working.
Okay, and moving on to ESG, advances in Vietnam. KPMG has a dedicated priority in this area as well for client facilitation to help advance the economy and also the society in general in Vietnam and Cambodia. So what's the professional take from your side on this?
We action ESG internally as well as externally. So from an external perspective, we have a full-service ESG advisory practice, which helps clients with ESG transformation, with ESG assurance and reporting, as well as ESG due diligence as part of M&A and deals. Besides, when we work with our clients now, we try to embed ESG in everything we do. So a project may not be a ESG transformation engagement, but when we go through our systems now to get a project approved, we actually always are prompted to consider, is there an ESG angle there? And if so, do we make sure that we have the right specialist involved to make sure that we can address our clients' business challenges, their financial issues, as well as the ESG requirements that they may have? From an internal perspective, we have our KPMG Impact Plan. This is a global plan rolled out across all of our member firms in which we have 4 pillars, which are planet, people, prosperity, and governance, under which we have 15 initiatives, most of which are directly tagged to the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So this may include achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2030. It may include understanding and improving our impact on nature and biodiversity, promoting an inclusive culture that values diversity, as well as fighting against any type of corruption, including bribery, extortion, etc.
Wow. So on the 16th of August 2022 in Ho Chi Minh City at the Sofitel, they had the annual Sustainability Corporate Reporting Awards. In 2021, listed company Vinamilk was the major marquee winner of the awards there. It's sponsored by 11 stakeholders, the State Securities Commission of Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh Stock Exchange, Hanoi Stock Exchange, the IFC, part of the World Bank, and also the ACCA, and also KPMG as one of the big 4 primary sponsors of this award. So the thrust of that is, like you were talking about, ESG, renewables, energy, wastewater treatment, environmental awareness. And when that kicked off here in Vietnam in 2013, they only had around about 132 reports that passed the criteria to get into the selection of the SRA Awards. And last year they had 500 FS audited reports that were able to be looked at. And they had 109 of those that passed screening, and 23 of them went into the final, Vinamilk being the winner. So what you're doing and what you're doing combined with the stakeholders there, I think is a tremendous thing to help lift Vietnam into a similar status as any of the developed world economies, regardless of the drive to net zero by 2030, or in Vietnam's case, a commitment to 2050. Prior to then, the individual companies, the listed companies, are each doing their part. So it's good to see KPMG as a primary stakeholder there sponsoring this advancement. Now, a couple of things. Lastly, financial statement transparency. In like IFRS and some of the other markets, ESOP, employee stock ownership plans, ordinarily you'll get, say, a Jeff Bezos. It'll show his salary, and then it'll show his stocks that were awarded in number and vesting price and timeline each calendar year or each financial year. Presently in Vietnam, it's more of a case of a gross amount that they'll report. So say if there's a listed company on the Ho Chi Minh Stock Exchange, it'll say this year they've announced that there will be 5 million shares at 10,000 VND a share to reward and retain key employees. But there's not really, in a financial statement way yet, the names of the individual employees that the public can read, and how many shares they get, and at what strike price and vesting timeline that they will be received. Me personally, I think that's probably one of the last pegs in that they need to nail down in place to be as transparent as any developed markets. Do you have any comments on how you think maybe that part of enhancing corporate governance and transparency could go in Vietnam?
It's a really interesting point, and I think the move globally is definitely towards transparency. We do see that investors do value transparency when they invest and manage companies in Vietnam and Cambodia. And if we look at some of the trends that are happening around the world, say in Vietnam, like you say, there's the way that we disclose things in financials, but then when it comes to accessing private company financials, for instance, that's much harder than in some countries in Europe, for example, right? So in the UK, in a lot of European markets, you're able to extract private companies' financials directly from the company's house, often for free, which gives a lot more transparency. There's global moves also towards more transparencies around working capital performance. So in definitely the UK, in Australia as well, there's now legislation whereby companies actually need to upload to a government portal on what kind of payment terms they pay their suppliers and how late beyond the due days they actually pay on average, which in a way is a positive move because it really opens up transparency around any cases where small suppliers, for instance, may be disproportionately impacted from long payment terms, late payment performance, etc. So in a way, it's almost self-governing so that companies are becoming more conscious as to what kind of payment terms they apply, payment processes they apply through this kind of transparency. And we may well see similar developments in our markets in the future.
Very good. Okay, Tim Kramer from KPMG, the Vietnam and Cambodia head of the Special Situations Group, which is a very important part of the KPMG franchise in Vietnam and Cambodia, which is helping both the FDI scene and also the FII space in Vietnam's capital markets and equity space. Tim, thank you so much for being on Mirae Asset Live, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. Steve Brown from Mirae Asset Securities, Head of Institutional Sales. Have a good morning.